That's good.
Okay, delighted to have a friend of Cedar, longstanding Shota Ishii from ProssimoTech, and he's speaking on optimizing financial supply chains network approach.
All right. Here's 6. All right, thanks. Oops. Oh, this.
Then I see off button. Oh. Yeah, so just to be
These two. Okay, great. So sorry about the delay, the challenges of parking at Berkeley. I just arrived from Tokyo yesterday and then drove up from Palo Alto. So it's been quite a ride. I realize we're a bit pressed for time, so I'll just speed through some of these slides. It's a very non-academic, hopefully a little bit of fun story setting up the problem of how we think about supply chains. And I'm going to first talk about why this is important. So, if you think about supply chains, this is an index of global sort of stability or fragility. And so this black is geopolitical risks. This gray, it's hard to see, is different safety events. This is like disease. And as you can see, the world has gotten a lot riskier and more fragile since about 2016. What this means is that it has the potential to disrupt supply chains. So when it was easy to buy iPhones and washing machines and et cetera, but right now we're seeing a lot more disruption in supply chains due to COVID, due to war, due to geopolitical tensions, et cetera. And McKinsey estimates that 100-day disruption in supply chains can have an average impact on EBITDA from -42% to 54%. And of course, this is an average over different industries, so it depends on which sector. But supply chain disruption is quite impactful.
Can I go back for a second? So in 2016, the only event I can think of is Trump. Is that? What else happened in 2016?
So this is global, so I don't know what exactly 2016 is referring to, but we did have, different types of diseases in different places. In 2016 itself, I don't remember, it could have been Ebola or something. Yeah.
What about the geopolitical risk in 2019?
Pardon?
Black bars. 2019.
Yeah, 2019.
What happened there?
2019. What did happen? I don't quite recall. So this is actually, when did COVID start? 2019.
Well, effectively 2020.
In 2020, right? Yeah. So this is actually an index published by KPMG and a research company called ASCM. Right. So, and what did global supply chain leaders do? They actually started increasing inventory, dual sourcing, meaning finding more than one supplier for the same component, regionalizing or nearshoring, so building things closer to home, and expand backup production. Right? And this is an example from over 10 years ago. So this is in Japan, where I live now, but this is the example of the 2011 Tohoku earthquake in northern Japan. And this is Toyota's production as a percent of change relative to the previous year. So, I think the earthquake happened in March, and then the production dropped -62% in March, -78.4% in April. So quite significantly relative to the previous year, right? And it took about 6 months to kind of recover. And focusing on one component. So this is a component called an MCU, multi-controller unit. So it's a semiconductor, right? Toyota's production fell precipitously because it's single sourced from this company called Renesas, right? Why did they only single source at that time? And the reason is it's actually not that easy to build in resilience. And so if you look at the quality requirements of an MCU, you have kind of humidity tolerances of 95%, defects tolerance of 1 part per million, durability 20 years. So this is actually extremely high quality manufacturing, which is hard to replicate. And in fact, Renesas provided 44% of production share at that time, of which one plant in northern Japan was 20%. So it's actually very difficult to build out resilience in supply chains, in fact. Right? And what did Toyota do afterwards? They decided to create a database of suppliers and parts. multi-source suppliers hold more inventory, regionalize the supply chain, standardize components, etc. So some of the things that I mentioned earlier. So this is leading to hopefully, this is just one example, but a lot of companies are going this way, leading to more visibility, simplicity, flexibility, and redundancy, which is great, but it goes against this notion of lean production. And lean production is when I just order things just in time, so I reduce wastage. So you have this situation where you have trade-offs between efficient and resilient, between kind of less inventory and more inventory. So having more spare parts is more resilient, you're more resistant to shock, but you're holding more inventory. That means you have to kind of house those goods and keep it safe, etc. So that's less efficient, right? Single suppliers versus redundant suppliers, global versus regional, lean versus having excess capacity. So the question is, how do you actually kind of look at these trade-offs? And so since then, the world has moved to trying to model out supply chains. And the first question is very obvious, which is, what is a supply chain? How do we define it? Well, first of all, you have a buyer, then you have a supplier, and then you have the supplier, and so on, right? And this is called tier 1, so the first level supplier. This is called tier 2 supplier. And so each tier will kind of add on. And so there's sort of a dependency in this. And my company, Prossimo, is actually focused around looking at the financial supply chain. So this is kind of looking at not the physical flow of goods, but the flow of money through the system. So it can be more easily abstracted, right? Now, one of the difficulties in modeling this out is that there's a lot, you say, if you think about automobiles or some other complex contemporary product, there's a lot of suppliers. So if you look at General Motors has 856 publicly disclosed tier 1 companies, tier 1 suppliers, and over 18,000 tier 2 suppliers, right? Airbus, an airplane company, has over 1,600 tier 1 suppliers, 12,000 plus tier 2 suppliers. So it's a lot of companies to track, right? And not all of them are publicly listed, so it's very difficult to get data. You also have this depth issue where you have kind of more visibility and then less visibility as you go deeper into the supply chain, okay? Because these tend to be smaller companies. You also have concentration and lack of substitutes. So maybe there's this one small supplier in Germany that makes this one very special product and you cannot find some other source for it, right? So you get these bottlenecks in the network. You also have complex interdependence. So basically, a lot of these suppliers are suppliers to each other, and they're sort of connected in different ways, both physically and from sort of the trade perspective, which makes it difficult to sort of model out. And in industry, most of the ways people are using to manage these types of supply chains are still overwhelmingly spreadsheets, right? So it's very, very basic the way people are managing these. And then you get into these disruption scenarios where basically you might have a fire or some attack or some sort of accident, and then you need to reroute this component through different suppliers. So you get into questions of what are the losses, who can supply this, and what's the best way to route this. So it's an area that's quite rich in terms of questions to ask, and the impact is quite great from a monetary perspective. Right? Any questions? Okay. And then the other thing is, again, financial supply chain. So these are less well understood. So again, you have kind of this supply chain here. Sorry, the gray is a little bit light in color. But one of the interesting things is that you get this accumulation of delays in payment, right? So let's say that the standard payment terms, you send an invoice and you get paid in 30 days, right? So the tier 1 supplier gets paid in 30 days, the tier 2 supplier gets paid in 30 days, et cetera, et cetera. So you get this kind of cumulative delay in payment, which means that there's a lot of capital that's stuck in the system in between payments. And obviously finance 101, time value of money. So there's a lot of capital stuck in the system, right? And as you go further into the tiers, typically these are smaller companies, so they have a higher cost of capital, meaning that money is more expensive for them. So 1 minute of money is more expensive for the smaller company than it is for the larger company.
So the tier 1 companies contract with tier 2 says, you don't get paid until 30 days after we get paid, is that what it said?
It depends on the situation. So this is a simplification, but oftentimes that's the case. In the case of companies like Walmart or Amazon that have immense purchasing power, they will push out payments to 120 days, 200 days, just because they can. So in effect, they're being financed by their supplier. So if you think about it, the weak are financing the strong, right? And this has become actually an accounting issue because if you delay payments, you're actually kind of almost borrowing money from your suppliers, but it's not counted as on balance sheet debt. And it has no impact on the credit rating. So they pumped up this borrowing from this sneaky way of borrowing by delaying payments.
So it seems there ought to be an arbitrage to there that presumably Walmart's borrowing cost is low
Yes,
and its suppliers are presumably much higher.
yes. So that's exactly what we focused on.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that's why God invented factoring, right?
So yeah, I'll get to that. So factoring actually pumps up again debt, which actually increases the credit risk. So you get this other trade-off, which I haven't shown here, between kind of increasing levels of leverage versus having faster money or liquidity, right? And there's a trade-off there where, again, people that become reliant on factoring tend to use it more and more and more and become more and more leveraged. And therefore their credit risk goes up further, increasing their cost of capital further. So there's this vicious cycle that tends to occur. So this is what happened with some cases. I don't know if you're familiar with a case called Greensill, which is a factoring company, and they ended up blowing up Credit Suisse and SoftBank, among others. So yes, so factoring is a partial solution, but in fact, it's actually a stopgap to kind of help alleviate the immediate pain of not getting paid at the at the expense of increasing your leverage.
Right, but it addresses Bob's point, which is you have a low credit, a low credit borrower who's financing a high credit buyer, and by factoring, the low credit buyer manages to reduce their funding cost by effectively selling a receivable from Walmart, a very high credit borrower.
They are actually paying a higher cost in the sense that they're paying for that credit, right? So they're paying a credit cost, but it's hidden, it's bundled in. This is something that I'll get into. Is oftentimes the credit component is bundled in and not kind of, you need to decompose the price of the object or the good from the cost of credit from the time component. And I think this is part of the interesting problem that we're going to be looking at. So, sorry, this goes till 12, right?
You actually got till 12:30.
Yeah. Oh, 12:30. Well, okay. Actually, and my quant got COVID last week, and I couldn't, and I got blocked out of my repo. So so this is mostly storytelling. So if you have any questions, I'm happy to sort of take time to talk about it. But first of all, how do we kind of then start to describe this network, right? So this is kind of tier 0 and tier 1, the first supplier, tier 2, first supplier, second supplier, third supplier. So you kind of have this generic tree structure, right, of suppliers. Now, sometimes you get these kind of cases where one company will be supplying to both companies, right? So it's actually, so that's one twist. The other thing that's important to look at is sometimes a company will be supplying to your competitor. And so that also has interesting implications for competitive pricing and negotiating power. So you kind of get into this game theoretic considerations as well. But this is a very simple generic setup. And this entire tree is actually quite big. So oftentimes for the purpose of analysis, we'll define kind of a scope. So how we'll kind of draw a circle around what we want to analyze. So again, it's kind of a network structure, and what are we trying to encode in the edges? So kind of this supplier relationship can be defined by who's the buyer, who's the supplier, how much money is traveling through And then also there's a probability, we can make it probabilistic. So what is the probability of this 100 going through or not? Again, you might have disruptions, you might have other contingencies that make it into something more of a stochastic problem. What else matters? So this is kind of a list of things that we need to consider. There's a bit more detail than this, but just kind of going over the basics. So the value, so the dollar amount of the transaction, the tenor or the time between invoice issuance and the payments. How long does it take for you to get paid? The cost of capital. So there's cost of capital both for the buyer and the supplier. Okay, so you need to think about both. Then you need to think about what I call the return cost. So it's the opportunity cost of foregone investment. What does that mean? That means that if I have cash, I can use that to pay someone, right, for the part I bought, or I can use that to invest in something else and earn a different return, right? And so there's kind of an opportunity cost of that. So I need to think about both sides of that. So both the capital cost and the return cost. And then kind of the criticality of the component. So how important is the component to the company? So I might have a supplier, but it's supplying me staples or paper, right? And I'm a rocket ship company, right? So it's not a critical component, but I do spend some money on it. And then substitutability. So how easy is it to replace that component? So if it's some sort of high-tech LCD screen, for my iPhone, it's very difficult to replace. Whereas something that's more commodities, it's more easily replaced. And then you might have other costs. So these are other constraints that you may want to layer in as we develop the analysis. So for example, in addition to capital costs, you may impose other costs such as ESG costs. Now, I'm not going to be very specific as to what that is, but you can put a placeholder for something like that to say, okay, I want to enforce constraints around, unsanctioned countries or companies being able to supply my goods, et cetera, or what have you, right? And then you also need to think about target liquidity. So it's the needed cash kind of that I need to keep my operations running day to day, right? So if I'm paying everyone out and then I run out of cash, I'm no good. So I need to think about kind of this liquidity. So these are kind of some of the things that I need to think about as I model this out. Okay. So I can then start to kind of come up with sort of a simplified mechanics of how this all comes together. So I have generically what I call the sources of capital. So how do I fund myself? And then how do I use the capital? How do I, so the sources and uses of capital, right? So in one way, as a buyer, I can get money by financing myself. So I can borrow money, I can raise equity, I can do different things. I can also get money by selling, so for my revenues, right? Another form of just source of capital, or just kind of my piggy bank, is just the cash pot that I have. Right? So I can use cash that I have on hand, I can use the revenues from the sales, I can use financing to borrow money or to raise equity, and then I could use that to pay my supplier, right? Or I could use that to make other investments, right? So I can, buy stocks, bonds, Bitcoin, what have you, right? So these are kind of the different choices I make. Now, from the perspective of the supplier, it's the same question all over again, which is, okay, then do I borrow money by financing? Do I use money from the sales that I sold to this buyer? Do I use it from cash? And then do I pay my supplier, or do I make other investments, right? So generically, we have this kind of like the sources of capital and the uses of capital. Now, one of the interesting things in practice is that in big companies, they have what's called the procurement department. So their whole job is to kind of go buy stuff, right? And then you have the finance department that's thinking about, how do I optimize my balance sheet? You have the treasurer who's thinking about, how do I manage my cash? And the silos, the organizational silos between the two sides make it so that they often make less than rational decisions about this. So typically, the procurement person is really focused only on this, which is like buying stuff from the supplier, right? And so his or her motivation is obviously like, how can I pay as late as possible, and how can I buy it at the cheapest price possible? Now, that may contradict the sort of global kind of what's best for the company from the perspective of the finance person, because depending on, again, the cost of capital, the cost, the opportunity cost of other possible investments, I may make a different decision. So in some cases, I may want to pay earlier. In other cases, I may want to pay a higher price, right? Just depending on that balance. So this has never, interestingly, been really systematically looked at as far as kind of just what I've surveyed, which is strange to say the least. Okay. So it looks like kind of a simple problem, but it's actually endemic in companies today. And my career, so I focused a lot on stocks, bonds, investment portfolios. That's been kind of my bread and butter for a long time. But I realized that actually there's a lot more what's we call operating capital rather than investment capital. So there's the stock market, bond market, et cetera, but there's a lot of this operating capital that is kind of unoptimized. So it's a huge opportunity as a business. So, and it leads into the investment capital via this, right? And comparing what are the uses of capital, what are the sources of capital. So for me, it was a very interesting, just as a parentheses, it was a very interesting segue to match kind of corporate finance with investment finance, with kind of the data analytics that we need to kind of solve some of these questions. Now, the other question is there's a time component to this. Again, time value money. So, again, do I pay slowly or quickly, right? So how quickly to pay or get paid? This becomes a critical question in how I can sort of optimize this whole setup. So the time value money, right? So this is Finance 101. But basically, let's say I have a 30-day invoice that gets paid in 30 days, right? So there's this payment that happens. And I'm waiting to get paid. So in the meanwhile, as a cost for the company, I need to keep the lights on, the operations going in the company for 30 days while I'm waiting to get paid, which means that I need to fund what's called working capital. Okay. So I need to somehow fund this purple working capital while I'm waiting to get paid. So now just theoretically, let's turn the tables. Imagine I get paid immediately. So in a world of what we call real-time finance, right? Boom. Zero lag payment, so I get paid immediately, then I don't need to fund this working capital. So that's bonus number one. And bonus number two is because I have the cash here today, I can choose to reinvest it in something else. So that's the opportunity cost of reinvestment, right? So I get two bonuses, the fact that I don't need to fund the working capital and the fact that I actually should be getting an investment return. Right? So in a frictionless kind of economy or setup, everyone should be getting paid immediately, right? And then kind of benefiting from this type of bonus, right?
That seems like double counting, but maybe I'm confused. So, okay, if you don't have to fund the working capital, that's great. You don't need to come up with it, but if you don't come up with it, then you also can't reinvest it. So, I see you're either having to come up with capital or not, but I don't see why you're getting the early payment gives you both a reduction in working capital and also reinvestment return.
So working capital is just capital money that I need to keep the lights on, right? To keep the operations running, right? So I'm actually reinvesting it in kind of my own operations, right? Right. Now, the thing is that meanwhile, so I actually need to fund the working capital, right? That's number one somehow, right? I need money to do that. Okay. So if I get paid earlier, right, that means that I can fund both working capital, and then if I have money left over, I can invest that into treasuries or something else, right? So it depends on kind of how am I funding myself here.
Yeah, I think Bob's point is that if you use the early payment for working capital, you can't get a return on that portion of the payment.
Correct. So the deployment, so there's only one use of this, right? So if I have enough money to be to pay for some of the working capital, and I choose to, it's not, yeah, if I, let's say, use half of it to pay some portion of the working capital, and then the other half, there's a great investment opportunity for 30 days, I can actually use that for the investment. So the question is, what's the correct deployment of this capital? That's one of the questions that we're trying to answer. So if I have like $100 today, you know, I should be able to kind of put that in, let's say, bonds or whatever, treasuries, earn a little bit of that, but I'm still, you know, but I might use some of that to fund my working capital. So I'm not necessarily double counting. So the sources of capital are typically what we call kind of financing by debt, equity, or some mix. And again, we can get into the subtleties of what this mix is, but you know, it's actually kind of a way to account for your cost of capital. You can get it from sales, your revenues, and you might get it from just cash on hand. Right? And the uses of capital might be operations, like we saw with the working capital. We might just stick it in cash, right? We might use it to pay suppliers earlier, or we might invest in return generating assets, stocks, bonds, etc. And again, we can't double count, or you know, we can't use the same capital twice. The other thing, so just as an aside, in terms of sources of capital, lower cost is typically kind of better, all things equal, meaning that, you know, debt is cheaper than equity. So I might want to use more debt if I have the debt capacity, which goes back to that factoring problem. If I keep borrowing money, my debt capacity, my ability to borrow goes down because I'm kind of increasing my credit risk, right? So there's kind of a trade-off with certain limits. And then in terms of uses of capital, again, all else being equal, higher return is better. So the question is, what returns are going to give me kind of the highest risk-adjusted return? Now, the thing is, again, the cost of debt and equity is actually dynamic. So this goes back to the very first slide with the geopolitical risks in COVID. With increased macroeconomic risk, the cost of equity, cost of financing goes up, right? So it's always constantly changing. The other thing is that these stocks, bonds, et cetera, these are subject to kind of market risk, right, and credit risk possibly. So you need to think about kind of these risks as well. So it starts to get hairier and hairier once I start kind of digging into the problem, right? And you can have multiple objectives. So depending on which perspective you take, am I trying to maximize the net returns for one company? So I'm going to take a selfish view. I'm the buyer, and I want to sort of maximize returns for myself. Or I might want to be playing a long game and say, I want to maximize net returns for all companies in my supply chain, right? So how do I actually kind of maximize the benefit to everyone? So that's kind of more of a bird's eye view of the supply chain, right? And I might have constraints. So I might be constrained by things like minimum cash, right? So I need to keep some level of cash on hand. And what we discussed, criticality, substitutability. So this gets into negotiating power. So one of the control variables will be kind of price. So how do I price my good? And that will be a function of how commoditized my good is or not. And then perhaps other costs such as ESG. Now, just on this, just on one of the constraints, this liquidity. So the liquidity constraint, this is in the realm of what, you know, if you're an investment banker, you're typically talking about maybe an IPO or debt issuance or equity issuance. So these are typically long-term capital, but we're in the realm of short-term capital in general. So this is kind of like, you have to think a lot about liquidity and whether you're going to run out of money as you're paying everyone out, right? All your suppliers out day to day. So imagine, right? So so thinking about just kind of this minimum cash constraint, how do I need to think about this, right? So imagine that in this scenario one, I start with $22 cash pile. So I have $22 in my pocket, right? And then I have to make these payouts to my different suppliers through the month. So first I make my $10 payment, right? So now I'm left with $12, and then I pay out my $10 my next supplier, so I pay out another $10 and I'm left with like $2, right? And then I have to pay out my $10, boom. Okay, I'm in default technically, in the sense that I have no money left, right? So even though this company is, you know, if you look at it through, let's just keep going, right? So sorry. So I technically defaulted, it's the end of the game here, right? There's no more of the company. But I'm just going to keep going, right? So I'm technically at -8, right? Then I get paid by my customer. So I get like a +30, right? So I get my payment. So in this case, I'm fine in the sense that, you know, my payment +30 covers my kind of the money coming in covers the money going out, right? But too late, right? So it's -10, -10, -10, and the 30 comes in a bit too late. So the order matters.
Well, this is why people issue commercial paper or factoring, as we discussed earlier, which is just receivable-backed financing to manage the timing of receipts and disbursements.
That's right. So you see that in the second example that I'll have here, right? So you have the same thing, right? And then boom, I kind of do supply chain financing. So this is, let's say, factoring, right? But you'll notice that, you know, I've actually kind of pre-sold my sales, and so I'm actually borrowing against my incoming receivables. So I'm actually kind of moving this +30 over here, but I'm kind of getting a haircut. I only get $29. I don't get 30. I can't borrow $30. So that $1 goes to whoever's providing me that factoring, right? So because they need to get paid as well. So this helps manage that timing, where now I'm suddenly liquid again, and I can actually pay my third $10, right? And I'm fine, right? Except, right? Now, if I pay back, the thing is, like, if I have to pay back kind of this $30, meaning that, you know, that I don't receive this payment because it goes to the factoring company, then I can hit default. So what tends to happen is that I actually need to kind of use factoring over and over again. So it becomes kind of almost a cyclical thing, which is what you see in scenario 3. So I've used factoring to help myself, right? And then I don't want to kind of die here, so I'm going to borrow money again, and then I'm fine. Right? So I'm constantly liquid. Right? So this type of game is actually a game of time, of ordering, but also, on the other hand, if you think about the debt capacity here, I have no debt, so my balance sheet's good, but I've defaulted. Right? Here, I borrowed a bit of money, and then I keep borrowing money as I keep kind of rolling over my factoring. Right? So that has implications to my ability to borrow, and therefore my credit cost. Right? Yeah.
I don't understand why the 30 cut happens in the second. Like when we do factoring, don't we still there? I can't see it.
We've sold it, but we actually don't get this. We actually don't receive the money coming in, and we might have other payments too. Right? So. And sometimes, like, I mean, and there's different types of, I'd say, supply chain financing here generically. So there's factoring, there's invoice discounting, there's different ways to do that. So kind of, but in general, if I'm kind of borrowing, I'm basically borrowing against the future. Right?
I mean, things may have changed, but when I was in this business, a vendor would set up a receivables facility, and as soon as the receivables came in, they'd be sold off at a discount rate that reflected the high credit quality of the underlying retail company, like Walmart, who had bought the good or service from me, rather than my own much higher credit rate, so that I would effectively borrow Walmart's credit rating to finance my receivable book. And it wouldn't affect my credit rating directly. And it was just a matter of appropriately including the cost of the factor into my final price to my buyers.
Yes, that's right. If you have kind of strong buyers, so if you have again, if you talk about kind of going into the deeper tier, then it becomes a bit murky. So oftentimes,
Right.
you know, that
Right, then everyone's, you know, double B or lower, and you can't bring down your credit costs sufficiently to make it work, perhaps.
so what's happening is that actually for the first two tiers, it's often fine, and then beyond them, people are kind of getting kind of pumped up with all this, you know, kind of, it's almost like consumer finance for SMEs, right? So but you know, you're absolutely right. So you know, the factoring is a good potential solution. You know, depending on who your customer is, et cetera, and depending on the time, right? But you also do pay that sort of fee in the sense that you're, you know, I'm just simplifying here, but you're actually paying out that $1, let's say, you know, to the person who's providing you the financing. So so there is actually a P&L impact to this as well. Okay. So what you want to do is basically you want to make sure that you include a constraint where you don't go past the default point. So you kind of think about over the next X months or whatever the horizon is, how do I not fall below this default point? And then whoops. And kind of manage for that. So that becomes kind of a constraint that you want to impose into your model. Okay. So what happens is that as you're looking at this, you have all these costs and returns and constraints at each node, and they kind of pile up. And then you also kind of want to think about the price. So what price do you want to pay for that good? So let's say that originally, you know, it's $100. Then do you want to provide a discount for getting early payment, you know, as we were talking about? Or do you want to maybe, in some cases, pay a higher price and, you know, and pay later, right? So that might be another option. And also how quickly do you pay, right? So pay quicker, pay slower. And this kind of gets repeated throughout the network. So you might, so one of the things is that most current solutions tend to look at sort of bilateral optimization. So it's very transactional in the sense that you have one buyer and one supplier, but it has kind of repercussions across the board if you can kind of daisy chain some of the impact of this, which I'll get into this. So basically, you know, we're talking about sort of this ability to, you know, whether it's appropriate to model this as a network, possibly kind of probabilistic. And again, part of this is because we get these disruptions, we don't know exactly how things are happening. We get these penalties, penalty functions as a trade-off in time and costs generically. And again, as I mentioned, the cost of capital, liquidity needs, et cetera, are constantly changing. And we get these kind of disruptions, et cetera. So it's actually kind of becomes the atomic kind of interaction is actually not that complicated, but once you start kind of increasing the number of nodes and edges, then it becomes quite complicated.
I could imagine situations where it's not acyclic. But does assuming acyclicity make the analysis easier or computation easier, or it's probably
For sure, yes.
I mean, acyclic is kind of natural in the normal case, but it's probably not.
Yes,
Everything.
yes. In fact, you also get, so I'm talking about, so in this case, we're talking about like one supply chain for one product, but you might have two different like detergents and something else, right? Soap or, you know, something with shampoo. And actually you get a lot of kind of interdependencies and, you know, kind of cyclicality there. But I don't know if you get solutions to conversion with that.
Yeah, so an example might be if I mine iron ore, well, I need to buy equipment
Yes.
for that which has steel in it, so there's a cycle there, but
Yeah. So it becomes a question of, kind of
So practically would be a very good reason to say
yeah.
asymmetricity.
Yeah, so again, interestingly enough, most research and work is on kind of these physical supply chains and what's happening there, not around the financial aspects of this. Partly because the finance people assume that supply chains are, again, the procurement people's problem, right? And part of the issue is that, data availability and quality are quite uneven. So it's hard to get, particularly for non-listed firms, you get these very small rare earth suppliers in Africa or China. It's hard to get the complete picture, right? So oftentimes we need to go work with the client's suppliers directly. And so there's a data kind of extraction problem. Often the data are outdated, so it's like from last year, and so we can't rely on this. And things like bargaining power need to be estimated qualitatively. So what's the criticality of this component? It's it's very hard. Do you score from 1 to 10, right? So that becomes a bit murky. And often, the granularity issue is that sometimes the client will provide us like total annual sales with this particular supplier. Ideally, if you can hook into their ERP and get invoice by invoice, that gets you a much clearer picture, but that's often a hard ask. You also have different products and customer segments. So one company, if you're P&G, you might be, selling 100 different products. So that complicates the picture. So for example, we buy or we subscribe to a data set from FactSet that only covers about 31,000 companies. And these are mostly kind of larger companies globally. And the data don't go back before 2014 in cases. There's another data set by S&P, which we can use, which is even more expensive. So a lot of times you're kind of trying to look for clues from these supply chain data sets, as well as kind of cobbling together over actual projects with clients. So that's kind of like, yeah, go ahead.
Data, what do you mean, like financial statements or?
So so financial statements to get a sense of the company and it's that, but if you can get it invoice by invoice, then you actually get a much better picture of what's happening for each purchase order. You also want supply chain relationships. So who is the supplier? That's often a question, right? And then how much is the annual trade between them? Right? And what do they supply? Things like that. Yeah. Also, it helps as an additional layer to understand the ownership structure, but that's kind of another issue. Because there might be capital cost subsidies if you're having that type of subsidiary, or other relationships. Okay. So that's kind of how we generically set up the problem. So at Prossimo, we've kind of built up a little bit of a software to try to deal with some of these issues. So our clients would want to kind of look at some of these, throw in their supply chain and see how they can optimize. And oftentimes what we see is that we can indicate between a 2 to 16% improvement in their EBIT just by kind of squeezing out the inefficiencies and how they manage their cash. So if you think about 2 to 16% improvement in EBIT, that's actually quite significant, right? If you think about on a market cap basis, you get this multiplier on the other improvement. So it's quite a significant impact. So just to give you kind of a sense of how big these things are. So I'm going to kind of introduce one notion called cash conversion cycle. So CCC this is a metric that some management consultants latched onto in the 90s. Okay. And it's not a great measure, but it's a standard measure that talks about the length of time it takes for a company to convert its inventory and other things into cash, right? So it's made of 3 things: DIO, DSO, DPO. DIO stands for days inventory outstanding. So how long, how long is my inventory sitting there, right? If I have inventory that's not being sold, then it's it's kind of money that's stuck there, right? And then I have days sales outstanding. So this is kind of like, how long do I get paid? How long does it take for me to get paid? So I'm looking at accounts receivables, and then days payable outstanding. How quickly do I pay my suppliers? So it's how much inventory, how much money is stuck in my inventory, how quickly do I get paid, minus how quickly am I paying. And so typically shorter CCC is considered better because I'm actually converting faster to cash. That's the standard interpretation. Now, interesting story, right? So Toyota and Tesla. So Toyota's CCC is 107 days. Okay, the auto industry's average is 84 days. So you can see that Toyota is, it has almost like a month longer CCC than the auto industry. Now Tesla has minus 1.26 days. Right. So what that means is that Tesla is converting to cash much faster than Toyota. Now, why is Tesla negative? Partly because, like, for example, when you buy a Tesla, you can buy it online, so you have to pay, ahead of time, right, before you even get the car delivered. So even before Toyota and Tesla compete on the quality of the automobile, Tesla, from a financial perspective, is outperforming Toyota. So in fact, Tesla on an EBIT basis makes about 4 times more money per car than Toyota. And about 60% of that can be explained by this CCC difference. So if we were to say, okay, let's make Tesla and Toyota compete on the basis of how good of a car they have instead of how good their finances are. So let's equalize this. So if we play a kind of a mind experiment and we say, okay, let's make the CCC equal and equalize it to 54.4 days. Tesla would see a minus 20% change in EBIT, and Toyota would see a plus 11% change in EBIT. So as you can see, there's this asymmetric impact in the sense that it hurts Tesla more than it helps Toyota. Right? And why is that? It's because Toyota's cost of debt is much higher than Tesla's cost of debt is much higher than Toyota's, and ROC is return on capital employed, so that's kind of an opportunity cost of the capital. So again, Tesla has much higher kind of cost and returns on capital than Toyota. What that means is that Tesla, one day faster or slower payment for Toyota doesn't mean much, right? Toyota's like, money's free. For Tesla, one day is it means a lot. So that's why changing the CCC by one day will impact Tesla a lot more than Toyota. So now the problem is that if I'm Toyota, I cannot go to Tesla and say, hey, please extend your cash conversion cycle. They're not going to be that nice, right? They're competitors. So, but what can I do? I can indirectly influence Tesla, right? So what can I do? I can actually find a common supplier like Panasonic, which supplies batteries to both, right? And you can see DPO, days payable. So how quickly does Toyota and Tesla pay? So you can see that Tesla pays about 30 days slower than Toyota. So if Toyota slowed down its payments, right, and matched the DPO to about 92 days, then it benefits Toyota by about $17 million. And it would hurt Panasonic by about $28 million. So for Panasonic to keep the same capital position, it has to now go tell Tesla, please pay faster, or please pay a higher price. So this is how you can start to use kind of this network model to try to influence things, right, and play games.
Sorry, I want to make sure I understand that. So are you saying that Toyota says to Panasonic, you need to make Tesla pay faster?
Well, if Toyota unilaterally decides to pay slower,
Yeah,
Panasonic hurts.
sure.
Right? Now, Panasonic can't attribute all of this to Tesla, so this is a simplification. But Panasonic to kind of not have this negative impact would have to tell Tesla, please pay faster or please pay a higher price for Panasonic not to have.
Okay, so this is what they would have to get in order to come out even.
Yes. And again, this is
okay. So Toyota's not saying anything about
Tesla.
Yeah, because presumably that would seem to be illegal.
It's not illegal. In fact,
if Toyota told Panasonic to do something to Tesla, that would be arguably an antitrust violation, depending on what exactly they told them to do. But if they just do something and then they're hoping that Panasonic will
Yes,
then, okay.
yeah.
Now,
I mean, all this analysis is doing is showing the asymmetry in the situation.
okay, okay, so we're not really saying Toyota's actions are influencing how Panasonic deals with Tesla.
This can happen. So in a sense, you can weaponize finance like this. Now, I don't know about the, kind of the antitrust or whatever, but by understanding the asymmetries in the setup, now it's very hard to attribute all of this to Tesla. So because there's other car companies that maybe Panasonic is supplying to, right? So here I'm simplifying it just by showing it, but you could actually, I mean, when we do the analysis, we show, let's say you have the top 10 suppliers, and you could see who's benefiting more relative to another supplier. So. Yeah.
So, I'm curious, this type of data is dangerous for companies like Tesla, which have negotiated more favorable terms than the market otherwise provides. In this case, longer payment period. So Tesla, in the abstract, would prefer that this not be known. How is this data obtained? It seems very specific. I understand you can look at payable accounts in published financial statements and draw some general inferences, but this is very granular.
So I mean, in practice, we obtain this from banks that are working with.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
But we can infer this, a lot of this actually, from publicly available information as well.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, there might be something in the accounting notes.
Yeah, stuff like that. So this is, it's actually, yes. So you're absolutely right.
Okay.
There's a lot of detail that you can dig through.
I sort of, the real puzzle here is why Toyota is being so charitable towards Panasonic. And it suggests there may be a relationship between Japanese companies where it's considered irresponsible to max out your payment period. So there's a cultural factor might explain this, but otherwise the gap is huge. From this perspective, Tesla is getting half of Toyota's payment period as free financing.
Correct. So I brought this up to Toyota's CFO. The fact is that this is not rationally done, which is why we have a company. So basically, so Toyota's like, yeah, we know we pay our suppliers earlier because we like to take care of everybody.
Right. Okay. That's what it's a cultural thing. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And then I said, do you know how much? So basically, among their top 10 suppliers, not just Panasonic, but among their top 10 suppliers, Toyota is subsidizing about $3.5 billion worth.
Right. So that's right. You're giving your family of suppliers a gift. That's nice, but you need to know the price tag.
Correct. Exactly. So that's the conversation that drives our sales.
Okay.
Yeah. Thanks.
So how do you know Toyota doesn't make it up by paying less per unit?
Because if we know the price, right?
Okay, so these are adjusting for price differences.
I mean, there's different levels of depth that you can go into the analysis, right? So like I said, there's a trade-off between the pricing and et cetera, et cetera. Right? And that's what this toolkit allows you to do, is to decompose that, this time value money factor from the actual price factor, et cetera. Yeah.
Do companies really use this technique to hurt their competitors in real world?
So yes and no. So no one has, I mean, I don't know any company that has done it as explicitly as the way we've kind of modeled it out. But intuitively, many CFOs can do. So my business partner was at a company called Dell, which in the 90s used CCC and did that to hurt its competitors. So Dell actually extended its CCC and paid everyone longer. And it's an interesting story because what happened is that by doing that, Dell, by making its payment slower, hurt all its competitors, right? Because no one noticed, right? But what ended up happening over time is that, again, it's a repeating game. So the suppliers started increasing their price, right? So they started packaging that time value of money into the price of the component, right? And then so the industry price started getting higher, and then so the asymmetry disappears over time. So then the question is, what's the next asymmetric move that you can make? So it's not like you do this and then you're done. It's like people are constantly responding to this, and then there's market impact, or there's market disruptions and things like that. And that's why it's not like we do this consulting thing once and then it's optimized and done. You constantly need to kind of adjust the game because you have the competitors reacting to this as well. So this is exactly what I'm talking about. So most procurement people would say, okay, the price generically is the cost of goods plus margins, right? That's my price. But if you're a finance person, you know that there's a cost of capital and there's a required return. And this bit here under the red curve is typically unpriced or not rationally priced, as we've observed, right? And so and not only that, it's not a smooth curve like this. Often what happens is that you get these COVID or war or other things that's happening, and increasingly this is the case, as we saw. So it's kind of a curve that's like swerving around constantly. So how do you kind of dynamically adjust for this? And that's really kind of the question, right? So we're trying to build out this intelligent orchestration platform that's trying to orchestrate across these players and then trying to kind of solve for what makes sense. And so again, going back to this picture, one of the things that you can do is, just as an example of what you can do with the deployment of capital, is you can pay your suppliers earlier for a discount. Right? So you can actually say, instead of keeping money in cash or treasury, which a lot of treasurers do without even thinking about it, right? And it's earning nothing in treasuries, right? But I'm going to pay my supplier faster in return for discounts. It's like, instead of in 30 days, I'll pay you today, but give me, a 5% discount.
It's interesting. It's right now, treasury money market funds are paying over 5%, which is, of course, as your comment suggested, historically unprecedented. So it'll be interesting to see how that affects working capital management, which is what a lot of your discussion focuses on.
Correct, absolutely. So it's interesting, particularly like I'm from, I'm living in Japan. Japan, like, money is free. So this is a lot less appealing in Japan and has a lot less hold for Japanese CFOs. But when I go to like Thailand, where cash is, has much higher returns, then you get into these different discussions. So it's actually very market specific, it's situation specific as well. But yeah, so and then the other thing is that you can actually because this supplier has money faster, it can send money faster, it can pay faster to its supplier and get a discount, right? So you can actually cascade this effect, and you get sort of this multiplier effect as well once you start modeling this as a network, right? So just going back to basic accounting, what are we saying? So let's say that I have $100 worth of revenue, $45 cost of goods, so my gross margin is 55, and I can reduce this cost of goods sold by paying faster, right? And paying a cheaper price. So I can take it from like 40 to 45, and thereby improving everything else that comes below it, right? So this is kind of just the P&L component of accounting, but I have to also think about the returns and the time, right? So it's actually kind of an interesting game. Now, what I can do is, this is an example where Toyota typically pays its tier 1 supplier Ishin in about 56 days. So if Toyota were to pay Ishin immediately, right? So Toyota and Ishin have about $2.2 trillion of trade annually between them. So the question is, if Toyota pays Ishin immediately, what's the time value of money for 56 days worth of $2.2 trillion? Or sorry, $200 billion, sorry, mixing up yen and dollars. So about, yeah, at Aishin's cost of capital, right? And it's about $254 million. That would improve Toyota's EBIT by about 0.9%. So in a 1%, just FYI, 1% improvement for Toyota in EBIT is huge. Right? And then Aishin, now that it has the money faster, can pay Exity, another tier 2 supplier, faster, right? Getting a discount and improving Aishin's EBIT by 2.7%.
Does the EBIT increase take into account the opportunity cost?
Yeah, so this is taking into account the opportunity cost, everything, all the other costs and constraints, right? So if I had internet, I could show you on my little tool. But what we as a company are trying to create is this kind of brain that's doing this, what we call liquidity marketplace. It's orchestrating between kind of suppliers in the supply chain. Actually, here's a small screenshot of that, of our little tool, right?
So you probably know this, but 20 years ago, this presentation could have been made about just-in-time inventory management.
Exactly.
It's exactly the same issue, that by not holding inventory unnecessarily, you increase your return on capital an amount that surprised all of the American manufacturers, and they learned that from the Japanese. Here it's going the other way. Americans
right.
know finance.
Ironically, yes. The Japanese were always better at making stuff than dealing with money. So, you know, and one of the interesting things that's available, so this is a fact. So, you know, we've checked with kind of bankers, but typically suppliers offer, this is a global average, so it depends on the region and what sector you're in. But suppliers can offer between 1% to 6% discounts for a 30-day early payment, depending on the industry and the country, right? This is global average, right? So what does that mean? If it's 30 days, and I assume, let's say an average of 3% discount, then on an annualized basis, right? I'm getting like, you know, more than 36% a year return on this, right? Which is much higher than like investment in private equity, right? With no market risk or lockup. So it's actually a very good way to generate returns and create value. And this is one of the key takeaways, at least as a practitioner, right? And if you,
So what I get from that slide is everybody should pay tomorrow and take the discount. Why doesn't that happen?
well, so this is not, so it's not always the case, because sometimes the supplier has a lower cost of capital, right? But in the case we saw below or before with the, like the example I gave with Toyota, I chose that because everything lines up very well. Toyota has lowest cost of capital, and it's big, and then Aishin has the next lowest cost of capital, so everything lines up. And you have all these combinatorics where sometimes the cost of capital is higher for the supplier or the buyer, then you have the opportunity cost of investment, reinvestment higher or lower for the so that's part of the reason. But the other reason is
So I
that
can see why there'd be a lot of friction and you wouldn't get there, but so you're telling people how to optimize, but couldn't the advice just be pay immediately and take the discount?
not always, because again, depending on the constraints and your objective function. So
It's a really big discount.
it's a huge one, and this is, and so at the first level of approximation, that's what everyone should be tending toward. Meaning there's too much capital that's tied up, choked up in the system.
Now, why do suppliers offer discounts that big?
It's irrational. But
It's
they feel
It's irrational on both sides.
well, it's
They
that
offer too big a discount and the buyer doesn't take the discount.
what happens in practice is it's like you go to the bazaar and it's like, oh, you know, I'll pay you 30 days early, just give me a 5% discount. And that 5% comes from nowhere. It's just literally you know, you pick up the phone and you're bargaining.
Well, there is a huge risk reduction benefit to getting paid immediately, as your previous charts showed, where you have a risk of default that extends throughout the payment period. You know, while you're waiting to get paid, really bad things can happen.
Correct. So so again, I don't think anyone that I've seen has kind of itemized all of these things, that all the ingredients that go into this analysis and done rational pricing constantly. And so when I say it's like a bazaar, it's literally like, there people intuit that there's this like, I need cash now in order to pay my my salary or whatever it is. So they'll do these types of discounts. So if there's and it's interesting, like I was just talking, so there's a supermarket called Tesco in the UK, and they source about 80% of their supplies from 21 suppliers. And each of those suppliers said, I'm ready to give you a 1% discount, 1 to 2% discount for 30-day early payment, which would have had a huge impact on reducing the cost of goods for Tesco. And again, the problem for Tesco was that they were already over leveraged. So they had borrowed too much money and they didn't have enough cash, and they couldn't borrow more money. So they couldn't take advantage of those return opportunities. So you get these real world constraints, which often explain some of the behavior. So our goal kind of globally is how do we kind of reduce the friction and start to optimize and get value out of it, and how do we as a as a startup start helping this out and getting some of that value.
Hey, Shota, question for you. Why wouldn't a bank just go out and build a portfolio of SME suppliers, give them what amounts to a liquidity credit line, which they might finance at like 10%, and then these firms are better.
Well, because bankers are busy with their day-to-day jobs, but we are actually having a lot of discussions with banks along those lines. So, but I'd love to talk to you about that. But yes, I mean, there's a lot of things that can be done in this space, actually. And one of the ways to finance this working capital is actually we've latched onto payroll, because payroll has this is a different topic, but if you use payroll as a way to finance this working capital, payroll has very low LGDs or loss rates, so it's actually a very attractive way to finance this. But anyway, these are some of the discussions that we're having with banks. But why don't banks do it themselves? For all the reasons banks don't do a lot of things better. So I wanted to show you like a nice picture of how you can optimize this, but like I said, this is just off the kind of manual calculations I had, because I lost access to my repo. But basically, so this is Nissan. Farish is a French supplier. Hirata is a tier 2 supplier, right? So 3 companies again. And this is just kind of a parameter sweep. So I haven't specified what are the combinations, but these are just like kind of going through. And basically the green means that you get this higher EBIT than, before for Nissan in these cases. Red means that you actually get a lower EBIT than before. And this is the sum of the EBIT change across 3 companies, right? So here I don't really find win-win-win situations. I find situations where Nissan wins and the other 2 lose, or the other 2 win and Nissan doesn't change. I can find a subspace within this where I actually do find win-win-win situations, right? So all 3 are green, and it looks like here the highest total value created, where the value creation, looking at the dollar EBIT value, is whatever this set of parameters was here, right? So I can start looking at these kind of combinations that start to provide value for all three companies. So yeah, so am I out of time almost? Okay,
Go ahead to 6 minutes.
6 minutes, okay. Yeah, so again, it's a real life problem. A lot of companies have started trying to get master data for their supply chains, creating what we call digital twins of their supply chains, trying to procure analytics for their supply chains, and then implementing kind of higher network and procurement controls. So we're sort of in this trend where this is becoming more and more important. And like I said, the amount of value release that's possible in the operating capital space versus kind of optimizing stock portfolios is huge. And so this, again, if you can have like a 1% improvement in EBIT, and let's say your EBIT multiplier is whatever 4 or 5x, that becomes a huge leverage point. So I actually sometimes do this talk for like PE firms or activist funds, and they love it because it's actually, a lot of companies these days are doing stock buybacks. But this type of thing, it's just doing math to actually improve the value of the company. So I won't have time to go through all the other slides, but you know, then we could start crossing this with the physical supply chain to look at kind of to make this even more kind of probabilistic and understanding how what are the implications that could happen in different scenarios, right? In disruption scenarios and pandemic scenarios and things like that, and start to learn how the organism, the network, starts responding to various shocks and various perturbations, right? And then start to predict out how you might want to mitigate the propagation of risks and things like that, how to price that in those forward-looking cases. So this is, yeah, so I'm not going to go through some of these, but basically what we're trying to do is to go from like this old school kind of map that's very static to almost like a Google map that's kind of real-time, data-driven, and actionable, right? And so typically, you know, you're trying to, right now, the industry is, you know, you have like people and spreadsheets and ERPs, and it's very much like that. And what we're trying to go towards is more intelligent analytics that brings in a lot more sort of data science, real-time data. You have these sensors that's informing production and disruptions and things like that. Right. So this trade-off between efficient and resilience can be mitigated at least you know, in part by more data and intelligence-driven supply chain orchestration. Again, you know, we're focused on sort of the financial supply chain side, but this goes through kind of the entire supply chain. So that's a little bit of what we're. If anyone's interested in this space, you know, we'd be happy to collaborate because we need all the help we can get to try to think through some of these things. The latter slides that I jumped over are kind of the interesting extensions that we'll be getting into. So I guess that was
Okay, questions?
How did you get to that win-win situation?
How do you get to that win-win situation?
Win-win-win.
Yes, so if let's say that, you know, you as a supplier want money faster, right? And so that's one way to win. Another way to win is if you can increase your EBIT, or if you can increase your profits, right? Or some combination of both. So imagine, and then you have like time, how quickly do I pay or get paid, and then you have like cost of capital. So imagine if I can create a surface of that and then find a subspace where all the companies in the scope, in like, let's say 3 companies or 4 companies, are either profitable or get paid faster, or both, then I have a win-win-win situation, right? And again, you know, companies lack the facility or the way to search through that space systematically because they didn't capture all the variables and have the models.
So what service are you selling? So do you go in and say, you know, we're going to tell you how to make your operation much more efficient, and you pay us a consulting fee? Do you sell them software which they can then run themselves day by day? What is it?
So we've pivoted to this about 2 years ago, maybe. So right now we're still very much like doing a lot of consulting, but we don't want to be a consulting firm. So the idea is ultimately to create what we call a liquidity marketplace. So imagine you have like a bid ask for how many days and you know, what's the price, but that can be orchestrated across multiple suppliers in a supply chain. And then sometimes you need funding for that. So, and we don't have a balance sheet because we're a startup. So we will partner with banks who provide the financing. So we have a sort of financing source, and we partner with banks to provide a liquidity platform. That's kind of the business. And then we would get a percentage of the value created. That's kind of the business model.
Okay, any other questions?
So yeah, if you have any questions or want to reach out, feel free to.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.